Hey guys, this is the second time I'm trying to make this video. Something happened during the first one that, well, kind of put a damper on my day, but it is what it is. Anyways, I was going to talk about my video the other day about Lord of the Rings and kind of cut people off at the pass about Tolkien's story being about Christianity. Now, he specifically says in the prologue of his book, his preamble, technically, that Lord of the Rings is not a Christian parable. But that doesn't mean what a lot of people think it means. It means that it's not a one-to-one comparison to the Bible. Like, you can't just say, like, Aragorn is Jesus and, like, Gandalf is God or anything like that. That's not how that works. What it actually is that the lore of Middle-earth is a pre-Christian society. So you can't say they're, like, representative of the Jewish people or anything like that. Even though at one point when Aragorn sees the Lady Gadriel, he kind of like puts his hand on his forehead like this as if he's about to do the sign of the cross. It's like a pre-Christian society. It's not like Narnia where the lion is like implicitly, maybe even explicitly, Jesus Christ himself. He was there when the earth was written and all that. But moving on from that, as awesome as the Peter Jackson films are, a lot of people nowadays watch the extended edition. And there is one part of the extended edition that a lot of people lament not being in the theatrical cut. And a lot of people think that it should have been in the movie, it should have been left in. And I think me and my brother both agree on this, is that the scene doesn't make a lot of sense if you know what happens in the books. And the scene I'm specifically talking about is when the Fellowship, minus Sam and Frodo, of course, because at this part the Fellowship has been broken. But Gandalf, Gimli, Legolas, Aragorn, Theoden, Merry, and Pippin, and some other captains go to Isengard, and they meet Saruman on the top of the tower. Now, this scene sorta happens in the books, but they take a lot of liberties with it. So, in the books, Saruman survives the War of the Rings and goes on, is released by the Ents and leaves Isengard and heads west. And after the war, Aragorn asked the Fellowship to stay in Minas Tirith for a little bit longer, and he doesn't say why, but for seemingly a few months, Frodo, Sam, Merry, Pippin, Gimli, and Legolas stay in Minas Tirith until one day Gandalf and Aragorn sneak out of the city, and they go up the mountain and find a sapling of the white tree planted there by some unknown person at some unknown time. And Aragorn, seeing this as a sign, takes the tree and plants it in Gondor's capital city in the courtyard to replace the tree that was destroyed during the war. And that's when the elves, including Arwen, finally come to Minas Tirith so that they can perform the wedding between the now King Elisar, as Aragorn would become known, and Arwen. And that's why they stayed in the city. And Frodo finally understands the purpose. And after a few weeks after that, they leave, and King Elisar, Aragorn, says that he and the rest of the Fellowship, as long as a grand funeral procession, will leave Minas Tirith and head west. And they bring the body of King Theoden, who died during the Battle of Pelennor Fields, back home to Rohan so they can bury him. Then they continue west until Gimli and Legolas split off, heading north to Legolas's homeland, because Legolas promised Gimli that he would show him the ancient trees of the forest. And they continue on, and they stay in Helm's Deep for 3 nights. I think Gimli stayed with them for that part because he was the one who would eventually be given control over the crystal caves behind Helm's Deep, and he would become the lord of those caves and form a great, well, not a kingdom, but like a fiefdom, I guess, would be an appropriate term for it. And then they head on until they finally get to the crossroads where they can head back to Rivendell. And Aragorn says that eventually we'll meet under a clear blue sky under the clouds like this again someday, because the Shire was technically in Arnor, which is the ancestral land that was founded by Isildur's father. And when Isildur's father died in the war against Sauron, Isildur would take over that kingdom, even though he was also a joint king of Gondor. He could have claimed the high kingship like his father had and take over Gondor and Arnor, but he was, even though he had the ring, he was still a relatively humble guy, and he only claimed kingship of Arnor. And when Aragorn was crowned King Elisar, he took over the remains of Arnor as well as Gondor, which included the Shire, but he passed a law saying that no men would ever be allowed to enter the Shire ever again. It would just be left to the hobbits. But what he wasn't aware of is that as Gandalf and the hobbits continue onward to Rivendell, that they would meet Saruman, who was released by Treebeard, and Treebeard did tell King Elisar this, that he let him go because he pitied him, as well as his little manservant, Grima Wormtongue. And they continued on to the west, where they met Gandalf and the hobbits on the road. And Gandalf thought it was kind of strange, there seemed to be something up, but he seemed like a defeated man, and that there wasn't any more trouble to be had with him, or at least he was up to something, but he wasn't that much of a danger. And they get to Rivendell, they pick up Bilbo, and Gandalf goes on his way, and the hobbits head back to Bree to pick up their ponies, and then eventually head back to the Shire. And Saruman is there in the Shire, and he's there with Grima Wormtongue, and he's hired basically like a gang, a small army of what he calls ruffians, and they have taken over the Shire. In fact, they started to industrialize the Shire, taking over the entire economy, and they have been arresting and even in some cases, torturing hobbits, including one of the hobbits that was left out of the movies, which was a hobbit with the nickname of Fatty, and he was to watch Frodo's new home, which he had moved into after he left Bag End. Now, he had left Bag End because he knew that the riders were after him, and he wanted to move out and people to not talk about him, to like spread rumors about his travels. So he gave Bag End to his relatives, his greedy relatives, who had wanted the place for a long time, which was like his aunt, the woman that Bilbo really didn't like because she wanted Bag End. And Fatty stayed in Bilbo's new house to make it look like somebody still lived there, that Frodo had never left. And the Nazgul show up at his house, and Fatty raises the alarm. He escapes, he raises the alarm, and the Nazgul leave, realizing Frodo's not there and not wanting to fight basically what amounts to a police force, since the Shire didn't have a military. They could raise a militia if they really wanted to, which is what they end up doing when Frodo gets back. And Frodo, Merry, Pippin, Samwise are looking around and they're like, wow. They're like, that's where a windmill, a watermill used to be. It's burned down now. That farm is abandoned. Like, everything's overgrown. Like, this place is a mess. Like, they went off the war and they come back to a defeated homeland. And this is actually an allegory for when veterans came back from the First World War, where they met the cowards or the weaklings, the people who couldn't fight, who started to engage in crime, where all the strong men were out of town. And they had to come back and set things straight. And a lot of places had gone out of business. Stuff like that. They come in, and I think Pippin was the son of the Thane, like the local lord of the land. And he goes to his father, and he asks his father to raise the militia. And they take the militia as Merry, who is the son of the lord of... not Bag End. It's not Tookland either, because Pippin is the Took. I forget what he's the lord of. But he's actually like kind of like minor nobility in the area as well. So they raise like, they get the police force, they get like the militia, they find Fatty, who has been captured, and he has been starved to the point where the nickname Fatty no longer fits him. Because Fatty led a like resistance group against these guys, and they come in with the militia. They meet the ruffians. They ambush one group of like 50 ruffians or something like that, and like annihilate them. And then they have the last battle of the war and defeat them. And then Saruman and Wormtongue are captured as the ruffians flee, are captured, what have you. And Frodo gives the Wormtongue his last like chance of redemption. Like, you don't have to serve this guy. He is a cruel master. He doesn't treat you with any respect. You have nothing to gain from being with him. You'll serve him to the end of your days. You'll be old and gray, and he won't miss you whatsoever. Like basically stuff like that. Kind of summarizing it. And like Saruman says, like, no, he's basically my slave. He is pathetic. He's weak. He will be bound to my will forever. And he smacks him around. And that role, that like that, like, kind of speech given to Wormtongue is given to Theoden in the extended version. And in the same sense, in the same way, Grima gets up, he's furious beyond all belief. Saruman turns back to yell at Frodo. In the movie, he's yelling at Gandalf. And Wormtongue pulls out a knife and takes him out. Now, the next part is a part that some people may not understand, and I talk about this a lot. But in the Geneva Convention, it is illegal to kill a surrendering enemy. And the reason is pretty pragmatic. Because if you slay a surrendering enemy, then they're not going to want to surrender. And they will instead fight to the death. And not only that, they will also not take surrender from your guys either. And you can lose good men that way. People that would otherwise be traded back and forth, you can get back your good soldiers, bring them home, prevent, like, protests back home, because if you do something and get, like, a bunch of men killed for no reason, you can have protests with the families turning against you, what have you. However, it is not against the Geneva Convention to kill a fleeing enemy. Even if that enemy, like, drops their weapons, completely panics, and runs for the hills, they live to fight another day. They might get punished, they might get, like, court-martialed or whatever for cowardice, but they could just be handed another weapon and pushed back in front to the front lines, pushed forward, and you're going to have to fight them again. And the next time, you might not get lucky. You might not beat them the second time. So, Grima, after he kills Saruman, turns and he flees. Now, Merry Pippin, Samwise, and Frodo, kind of feel some pity for this guy. But the other hobbits have no idea who this dude is. They just know he was the second command of Saruman, and that he was leading the ruffians, and that he could come back someday with more ruffians and cause more chaos and havoc. So the bowmen, because hobbits for some reason are known for their skills with a bow, they're not anywhere as good as the men of Gondor or the elves. Certainly not. They use short bows. But they're good hunters, and short bows, while they don't have a lot of range and not a lot of penetrating power, are still good against soft targets who aren't wearing armor. And they turn Wormtongue into a pincushion. And Frodo's like, well, that's sad. And they give that role to Legolas in the extended version. And again, it really doesn't make sense from a lore perspective. It's just kind of out of left field to give the speech that Frodo gives to Wormtongue to Theoden and the role of the archers to Legolas, of all people. Because Legolas has elven eyes. He would know that the stab that Wormtongue did on Saruman was instantly fatal. There was no way Saruman was surviving that. And even though it kind of makes some sense that he would take out Grima because they want to interrogate Saruman, it's a little bit of, like, this guy just turned against his master. He's not exactly an ally. You're trying to interrogate Saruman, but Theoden just assured this guy that if he turns his cloak here and now, he will be allowed to return home unharmed, allowed to once again be a man of Rohan. And Legolas is a very disciplined warrior who's been doing this for thousands of years. You would think that, he would go for like an incapacitation shot instead of, going for the kill with Grima. or something like that. You know, just in case, like the two kings, Aragorn and Theoden, standing right there might take some offense to him just executing a dude without their permission after he was just given assurances that he would be allowed to return home. Again, extenuating circumstances, yes, they wanted Saruman alive. But it is what it is. Now, from a professional standard, two things have to be noted here. One, Christopher Lee, that was supposed to be his last scene, and it was supposed to be the wrap-up of Saruman's arc. And even though all of this would mean that the Scouring of the Shire never happens, it gave him like one last like hurrah and kind of wrapped up his storyline. But this is kind of like the reason why Christopher Tolkien didn't like the Lord of the Rings. As good as they are, Christopher knew, seemingly on an instinctual level and an intellectual level, that if a guy like Peter Jackson, who loves the Lord of the Rings, was willing to take that many liberties with the story, that even though he loves Lord of the Rings, that eventually there would be somebody who doesn't love Lord of the Rings who would take even more liberties to the point where it completely ruins the story his father wrote. Which is what eventually happened when Amazon took over and wrote The Rings of Power. And a lot of people also really didn't like the Hobbit movies because on one hand they expand the story to be 3 movies. And if you're not aware, The Hobbit is more of a kid's movie, or a kid's book, and it's shorter than the other 3 books. The Fellowship, Twin Towers, and Return of the King. And not only did they have to expand this tiny little kid's book into 3 movies, they left out a lot of details and changed a lot about the story. For instance, Azog died in the Second Battle of Moria. And in the Hobbit movie, the main orc leader was it Balzog or something like that? It's like a word that rhymes with Azog, but it starts with a B. But it's the son of Azog. And this is strange because it's the only time Tolkien ever mentioned an orc having a son. And it raises a lot of questions on how exactly orcs are born and made and created or whatever. And they completely take out Azog's son from the story and give the position to Azog. And then we got Rings of Power. But anyways, a lot of people are sad that Christopher Lee did not get his final hurrah in the movie. And the only argument I heard against including this scene from the people who talk about Lord of the Rings professionally on YouTube is that it would be a little bit of an odd aside to have the last movie's villain show up for a brief stint in the 3rd movie just to be killed off within the first few minutes of the story. Now it would set up Sauron as the greater enemy. It's oh well, we don't have to worry about Saruman anymore. But that was kind of clear from what was actually in the theatrical versions that Saruman's power was completely destroyed. After all, his army that attacked Helm's Deep fled into the forest and were ambushed by the Ents and completely annihilated. And that his forces that remained behind in Isengard were weak because most of them had already marched off the Helm's Deep. They were divided, which in the movie the Ents weren't aware of this. I'm not sure if they were entirely aware of that either in the books, but Treebeard still has the same lines where he's like, "We may go to our doom, or last fight ever." So it's kind of hinted at that they're not aware that Isengard has been left mostly defenseless. Because, well, obviously, one big part of why Grima was willing to turn against his master is because he was humiliated twice. His army was defeated at Helm's Deep, despite having an overwhelming advantage. His forces were destroyed by a bunch of trees, which, as long as they marched like right into a forge where there's a lot of fire, and even though they used fire, they weren't able to destroy a bunch of trees. Now, to be fair, the Ents are terrifying. It's not just as easy as waving around a torch for you to be able to defeat ancient Ents, but still. But then he was utterly and completely humiliated when his last forces were defeated by a bunch of hobbits. A hobbit militia, of all things. Now again, the hobbit archers are not that famous, but they did participate in 2 battles against the war against Sauron when this was thousands of years before the War of the Rings, when Sauron went to Celebrimbor, you know, the guy from the games, Shadow of War and Shadow of Moria, and he claims the 16 rings, the 7 he would give to the dwarves and the 9 he would give to men. And eventually Sauron's defeated, and the Witch King forms the kingdom of Angmar, which eventually destroys the kingdom of Arnor. And in one of the battles, the hobbits flee the Shire into the woods, but they give to the kingdom of Arnor their bowmen, which in the battle that follows are slaughtered, but fight valiantly to the death for the kingdom of Arnor. And later on, when Gondor and the elves come together to chase out the Witch King and to avenge the army of the kingdom of Arnor, which, again, the kingdom of Arnor was directly descended from Isildur, and the kingdom of Arnor was descended from Isildur's brother. And one of the reasons why Isildur did not claim kingship of Gondor is because his brother's son, his nephew, ruled Gondor, and Isildur didn't want to supplant his nephew. So they were literally brother kingdoms. They come to fight against the Witch King, and they are shocked because they get reinforcements from the hobbits, who have raised another militia of bowmen and sent them off to join the army. Which, after the first battle, the hobbits were slaughtered, and they shouldn't have that many men left. And they somehow pull together enough and are still willing to fight, despite having lost a lot of their own kin. And the elves are just like blown away by this. Because again, they're just using short bows. The short bows are not good against armor. But it is incredible that they are this willing to fight for the good of the world. Because at this point, nobody would blame them for sitting this one out. And again, this is the very heritage that the militia that defeated the ruffians, Saruman's ragtag, army is too strong a word, gang, Tolkien force, skirmishers, I guess. It's a bunch of guys with like clubs and blackjacks, basically, throwing rocks and such things. And they're the ones who are the ones to lead to the final defeat of Saruman, as diminished as he was, and killed Grima, which is not that impressive, but still, again, it shows that the hobbits are kind of sick of the whole thing, and if they can't take Grima prisoner, because again, they're halflings, and this is a grown man fleeing. Grima is not that great of a human specimen, but chasing after this guy, they're probably never going to catch him. So, they're not going to take this guy prisoner, so they're just like, screw it. He's going to run for it. He might come back someday. Let's just deal with this dude, and they turn him into a pincushion. Again, giving this role to Legolas, it makes sense from the movie's perspective. Sorta. Because again, they want to interrogate Saruman, and Grima, killing him would prevent them from interrogating him. But Saruman makes it abundantly clear he's not going to talk. And it just seems a little bit out of character for Legolas to kind of just, on his own, decide to shoot down Grima. Because moments before, in the extended version, Gimli is like, just shoot him. And Theoden is like, we will never forgive you. We will hang you from a tree if you come down from that tower. He says this to Saruman, and then gives Grima you're allowed to return to Rohan if you wish. So they make it abundantly clear that Saruman, they don't like Saruman. Both Legolas, Gimli, Theoden, everyone, except, maybe Merry, Pippin, Treebeard, I guess, and Gandalf, kind of want him alive. Or though, Merry, Pippin, and Treebeard are, ambivalent about Saruman dying here, but Gandalf is pretty insistent that, that Saruman, a literal angel, who is not yet fully corrupted in the demonhood, basically, could still, at the very least, give them information that could lead to the defeat of Sauron. And maybe one day be forgiven by the Ainur, which is, the other wizards, angels, whatever you want to call them. Again, the story of the Lord of the Rings is specifically said by Tolkien to not be a parable, as in it is not a metaphor, it's not an allegory, it is not it's not like saying that Aragorn is Jesus Christ or Gandalf is Jesus Christ. This is the world of man before Christianity, before even Judaism. In fact, God's chosen people haven't been chosen yet. This is a prehistory. Or, well, I guess not prehistory, because again, as I said in my last video, the way Tolkien talks about the story, it's as if he found this ancient manuscript and he is relaying the story as told by Bilbo, Frodo, and Samwise. But yeah, I just wanted to talk about it. It's like a lot of people, a lot of like the lore channels for Lord of the Rings online are like, oh, they should have included this scene, or this scene is so good. And you'll see a lot of people in the comments, it's like, ah, it's a shame Christopher Lee really wanted this scene. It was his final part of the play. It was the climactic, like, ending of his story, a wrap up, the epilogue to his, like, his betrayal. It allows him to, like, say his last curses, what have you. But again, the scene where he dies cuts out all possibility of the Scouring of the Shire, which is an epilogue to the War of the Rings, and includes the final battle of the War of the Rings. It makes sense for the movies to cut out the Scouring of the Shire, since it's kind of like the falling, like the last little bump in the road until everything is wrapped up. It's when the veterans come home and find that their land is not as it used to be, that the innocence is gone, and that the war has arrived on their doorstep, and the king, who has recently retaken this land, doesn't realize what has happened here. And the hobbits have to deal with business on their own and restore the Shire as is. And like there's like also a little bit of a part there where like gardens have been trampled, forests have been cut down, things have been destroyed, and Samwise has the soil that was given to him by Galadriel, and he goes around and in each garden that has been destroyed, under each tree, in each forest, he sprinkles just a few grains of this soil into each of these locations. And then for the next like 10 generations of hobbits, these areas grow wild with flowers and berries and fruit and trees and shade, so much so that hobbits have so much fruit that children never starve, and they spend entire seasons underneath the trees enjoying like apples and like apricots and whatever have you, whatever they grow in the Shire. And at least one of the channels, it might be Nerd of the Rings, or it might be Tolkien Explained or something, where he mentions this and he's talking about like the economics of Middle Earth. And this is like the whole meme of like George R. Martin talking about like one thing he didn't like about Lord of the Rings is Tolkien never talked about the economics of Middle Earth. Like, what is the tax policy of King Elisar? Like, and it became a whole meme. And like the channel that talked about this is like, okay, well, here are the economics of Middle Earth as we can explain it. And there was no real economy to the hobbits. That's actually why like Saruman could make a monopoly and like take it over and industrialize it so much, is because they didn't really have any trade. They kind of just shared amongst each other or traded amongst each other, and they didn't really need anything. They didn't really have that much technology. They were kind of a self-sufficient self-reliant community of farmers that didn't really have much of a government. They were a very small government people. Mostly leadership positions were ceremonial, where they would have festivals and what have you. A small token police force that they wouldn't really, arrest that many people. There weren't that many, crimes, hard crimes where people would have to be locked up for life. No murder or anything like that was very common. Mostly what the police force did is they helped, rustle up, escaped livestock, for example. But they make the argument that the reason why Samwise Gamgee became the 7th-time elected mayor of the capital of the Shire, basically there was only one elected position in the Shire, and that was the mayor of Buckland. And this was the de facto capital of the Shire. And the mayor of the Shire was also referred to as the mayor of the Shire, even though there was an inherited title of Thane that ran through the Took family. And each of their terms were 7 years long, and he was the 7th-time elected mayor, so he ruled, he was the mayor of Buckland in the town hall, in a pun, because, hobbits live in holes, so instead of being the town hall, it's the town hall. So here, for 49 years, and this YouTuber made the argument that the reason why he won the election in the first place is because of the goodwill that he gained from scattering the soil from Galadriel, from the Glen, that helped the Shire grow after Saruman's scouring. So again, the whole scene where Saruman dies in Isengard while being interrogated kind of cuts off the possibility of that grand adventure, the scouring and the rebuilding of the Shire, out of the story entirely, and gives the roles that Frodo had and that the Hobbit archers had to literal royalty, to Theoden and Legolas, which Legolas was a prince, by the way. His father was a king. Instead of giving it to the humble folk of the Shire. And it's as good as the Peter Jackson movies are, it makes a lot of sense that scene in particular was cut out. Because it is kind of padding, it's not really necessary, and it completely goes against Tolkien's original story. And it's kind of wild to me that people are like, oh, it should have been in the movies. It should have been in the movies. It's a good scene for the movies. But if you know the actual story, it completely breaks the legend, the lore, and the epilogue to the books. Again, the movies are fantastic. And Christopher was maybe a little bit too harsh against the movies, but it makes sense that he was upset and hesitant that they made all these changes. And one of the reasons why The Lord of the Rings was written in the first place is because Tolkien told these stories to Christopher as a kid, and every time he told the stories, he kind of forgot some of the details, and Christopher was a stickler. He's like, wait a minute, the last time you told this story, this guy wore a blue shirt, and this time you said he wore a red shirt. And it's kind of like a comedic story that Tolkien told, where he would go and he was like, fine, and he like writes down the story as Christopher remembered it. And apparently he was so frustrated with his son being so like adamant that it's like, wait a minute, you changed this, that he said, damn the child, as he was writing the actual books. And then he wrote one of the greatest pieces of fiction in history. It's because his son was so, I'm not going to say Christopher was autistic, because so many people are insistent about like throwing the words autistic and neurodivergent all over the place and being like, he's just like me for real. It's like Christopher was just had a very good memory, and he thought this story was amazing and that it should be committed to paper, and that his father wrote it the way he did for a reason, and he had a very specific story. Tolkien did change his mind on how some of the lore would work. Like, when he did his unfinished tales and he wrote the books and he wrote letters to fans, one of the letters he didn't send is that the explanation of where the orcs come from. And there were at least 4 explanations that Tolkien wrote for the orcs. And I don't want to get into that, but I'll get into it a little bit. The first set he wrote is that Morgoth, Satan, made the orcs out of stone. And he's like, wait, no, that's not right. Morgoth isn't as powerful as God. He can't create something out of nothing. Only God can create something out of nothing. So he had to corrupt something that already existed. So for his second explanation, he said he corrupted elves. In his third explanation, but then he was like, well, elves have souls. And do orcs have souls? And if they have souls, are they irredeemable? And if they do have souls, that means they're God's creation, and therefore they can't be irredeemable. So maybe they don't have souls. So his third explanation is that they were corrupted versions of animals. That animals don't have souls, therefore they could be irredeemable. And then in his final explanation, he starts to get in the like theology of it, and he's like writing to a fan, an owner of a used Christian bookstore, and he's trying to like explain where he thinks the orcs come from. And then he's like, yeah, they might be corrupted elves, maybe they were bred with humans, maybe they're just corrupted humans. And then he's talking about how they're creatures of evil, but not perhaps irredeemably evil. And then he starts to get into it, and then he cuts himself off. He stops writing the letter because he gets too much in the speculation. And then he's like, well, what constitutes a soul? Like, can he judge the existence of these creatures, and can he say that they're evil or they're irredeemable? And can he say that they go to where the elves go? Where, again, if an elf dies, they don't die. They don't need their bodies. Their souls go to the halls of Mandos, I think it is, and then they stay there for a time, and then their bodies are returned to them, and then they're allowed to do as they wish. And if they're corrupted elves, they would go to Mandos, and instead of being reincarnated, basically, they would instead be imprisoned until the end of time. But then he would have to say that, well, they would be in prison to the end of time, but if they're corrupted men, instead of saying that he knows for sure that the orcs will go to the halls, instead they will go to the other side where the elves aren't allowed to go, and they will enter the realm of Iluvatar, God. But then he's like, well, who am I to say where the souls of the orcs go to? Only God knows that. And he was like, I don't want to get into the theology of it, because then I'm trying to explain the origin of souls and where souls go to after we die. And he's like, that's not mine. I'm a linguist, man. That is, who am I to argue the theology of the existence of souls? That is in the realm of God only. Because again, he was a devout Catholic. But before I get too into it, again, Lord of the Rings, not a parable for Christianity, but highly influenced, and it speaks of man's understanding of God before the existence of Judaism and Christianity. Like, the Valar being either the cherubim, or perhaps the primacies, I think they're called, which are the beings of the lower order, in the same order as the angels, the elves, or the archangels, which would be like Sauron, Gandalf, Saruman, what have you. And whether or not Morgoth was a cherub, or whether he was an archangel, depends on which theological theory you're following. And cherubs are like, if an archangel is the second rank of the lower orders, I'm pretty sure the cherubs are either the third rank or the second rank of the higher orders. And there's 3 orders altogether. So a cherub is at the very least 5 or 6 ranks above the archangels. It's just, you know, a lot of people would argue, it's like, well, how could one of the closest to God, one of the cherubs, have betrayed him? It makes more sense than one of the lower, more imperfect creations, the archangels, may be able to betray God, but not the cherubs. But perhaps maybe. It's the whole theological argument, and Tolkien didn't really want to get into where the souls of the dead go to. And when, like, Sauron and Saruman die, for example, their souls are blown away by a western wind, the wind that comes from the west, back to the east, and literally their souls are scattered to the wind, where they're not able to reincarnate, and they must watch as Middle-earth, goes on and flourishes without their influence. And they're just trapped watching, maybe occasionally whispering into somebody's ear, telling them to sin in some way. Which, again, is what the Catholics, like me and Tolkien and his son Christopher, believe in, is that sins are brought about with demons tempting you into committing a sin. And like demons such as Sauron and Saruman are the little voice in your ear telling you that it's okay, you can lie, or you can steal, or you can try to dominate, what have you. But they're only whispers on the wind. And only those who give in to their weakness men occasionally fall for those whispers and sin, thus requiring us to either fall into hell or rise up if we recognize our sin, to be cleansed in the fire of purgatory. Again, there's a distinct reason Christopher did not like the movies, because this is very specific lore that his father based on Christian theology, and changing it like it was, again, having Théoden give the speech and Legolas being the one who shoots down Wormtongue, is against his father's intent, which can lead to some confusion and kind of breaks, like, again, not an allegory, but the connection the Lord of the Rings has to Christianity. And again, open the door for larger leaps in canon that led to, eventually, the Rings of Power, which is so far against what Lord of the Rings stood for and the Legendarium as a whole, which is what Tolkien's universe is called, the Legendarium, because the Lord of the Rings only refers to the war for the One Ring, starting with Frodo leaving the Shire, basically, to the scouring of the Shire. Oh yeah, anyways, I'll leave it there before I ramble on anymore. Originally, I was making this video, and I got to about 10 minutes in when there was a major accident that happened, like, right in front of me. And I had plenty of time to react. I wasn't involved in the accident whatsoever, but I stopped to call 911, and, well, that video is never going to see the light of day. It's short and kind of depressing, honestly, at the end there, so, but, yeah. I don't know if anyone died in it. The driver, at the very least, didn't die. I don't know if there was anyone in the passenger seat, but it was a very brutal accident. So, I've been staring at the road this entire time, and, yeah, so, be very careful out there, guys. Even when I make these videos, I make sure to pay attention to where I'm driving, which is why I often don't notice when my phone has slid down a little bit and, like, my face is no longer centered in the picture. I'd rather be a little bit unprofessional than have something like that happen. So, pray for the people involved in the accident, and I'll talk to you guys later sometime. Okay, bye.